All right. Thank you, Geraldine. Well, thanks for having me here first. It's been a long time since doing an in-person talk, so I hope it will go well. My name is Claudio. I work as a technologist and as a researcher at Amnesty International. And I'm going to, as Geraldine mentioned, going through a little bit of reflections and some details about this work of the last year that maybe some of you have heard about. But before getting to that, actually the first time I think that I came to Republica was probably about 10 years ago. I think actually 10 years ago by this year. And it was actually for the first time I came here to talk about probably my very first piece of published research, which was about still kind of the same subject, but for the very first time for me approaching what was the issue of the use of spyware and surveillance technologies, and at that time particularly in the context of the so-called Arab Spring. So during these times of social uprising and protest movements, it came to light that companies were building and providing surveillance technology to countries that eventually ended up using it to crack down on journalists and activists and dissidents and protest movements during those particular very intense years. And at that time, actually, the company that came out first through this process of investigation and research that involved journalists and technologists and others was actually a German company called Fisher, which you might have heard about, maybe. And you know, at the time, it was a new thing for me, and I kind of thought that it was a thing of the moment. You know, I think of this particular time in history where social struggles became kind of the forefront of international attention, and these sort of cases of abuse of surveillance technology, and in particular of spyware technologies, should have been, or at least I thought, should have been confined with that particular moment. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and that's why I'm here. And that kind of snowballed for me and continued working on these issues ever since, so for the following decade. But what is spyware? I don't think I have to spend too much time on this because we heard about this day in and day out in the last few years. What is the issues of cyber attacks and whatnot. But in essence, if you're not familiar with it, spyware is just a piece of software essentially that was specifically designed to be silently installed on electronic devices. At the time, in 2012, 2011, primarily on Windows computers. These days, as things have changed, smartphones have become probably the primary target of choice. And they're designed to just collect and harvest everything that is being done by the user with that particular device, whether it is taking pictures, writing emails, or having phone calls, or sending messages and all that. And weirdly, over the last especially 5 years, they've become a very prominent piece of technology that was once reserved perhaps for criminal activity, and now have become standard tools in pretty much every law enforcement intelligence agency all around the world and everywhere, including European countries. And in part because of the fact that encryption has become so ubiquitous. Now we use encryption constantly without even knowing. Probably most of you here use Signal or WhatsApp or apps like those that implement strong encryption. And so old methods of surveillance and wiretapping are no longer as effective, hence having to move into the device in order to collect and intercept conversations where and when they happen. Fast forward a few years, I ended up joining Amnesty International, and I started a little team called Security Lab, which is a small team of researchers that work on these exact issues, investigating the issue of digital attacks and targeted surveillance of civil society, and providing support to human rights defenders and journalists in times of particular need on issues of digital security and privacy. A couple of years later, as we continue investigating and doing our research as it goes, we come across this particular instance where a colleague of ours at Amnesty we found to have been targeted with this one particular piece of spyware, which just came out quite shortly before that, called Pegasus. And Pegasus is now perhaps more known than Fisher and other companies, but it's a piece of software. It's a surveillance system designed and developed by a company called NSO Group out of Israel, and somehow kind of overtook the market of the surveillance industry. And a colleague of ours, who at the time was working on issues of Saudi human rights in Saudi and supporting Saudi human rights defenders, found themselves targeted with it. And that kind of spawned for us a moment of realization that suddenly we're not just working for others, but we ourselves as researchers and workers in NGOs could be targets too. And initiated a process of trying to understand better what is this Pegasus and where was it being used and for what reasons and where else other than in this particular case. Others had been researching this before and during the same time, including Citizen Lab and other organizations. So it was starting to mount a bit of a momentum as to it became clear that this particular piece of surveillance technology, this spyware, was becoming quite prominent. Then it all evolved until a year ago, where we, in collaboration with a consortium of various other journalistic organizations, launched what became known as the Pegasus Project, which you might have heard. How many have heard of Pegasus Project before? Can you raise your hand? Oh, OK, so a decent amount. So I'm not breaking any news here. So for those of you that are not familiar with it, Pegasus Project was a large investigation that involved more than 80 journalists from many different countries and from 17 media organizations across the world, and including our small team of technologists, which provided technical support and led sort of the technical investigations behind these revelations. And it broke big. It revealed a massive global scale of abuse of this particular product to an extent that we have never seen before. To contextualize for you, while before this particular project, we would maybe work on a couple of cases a year of a particular activist or human rights defender being subjected to a similar kind of attack. Now, in the span of a few months in the course of this project, suddenly we had to deal with dozens and dozens and dozens at once. So the scale became way bigger than we ever had anticipated. And as a result, dozens of stories came out detailing how this particular piece of technology was so widespread and so widely abused in all sorts of contexts against all sorts of people from all sorts of walks of life. As a starter, journalists were obviously a big portion of the target base. This is a selection of those that have been identified in the process. It's not all of them. It's fundamentally those that have been confirmed and identified from the data that was available. And it's journalists from everywhere, from Azerbaijan to Mexico to Morocco and Spain and France and Hungary and Belgium and pretty much anything in between, and India and so on. And what's important here is that the moment we realized the surveillance of journalists and the targeting of journalists was so systematic, it raises an issue of what does it mean in terms of democratic values in society when those that are kind of supposed to protect free press are the ones that are subjected to these kinds of aggressions the most. What is important for me, and I very much invite you to go to the address that I link at the bottom, is to go and see each individual story, because more so of the fact that they were targeted with this particular piece of spyware, what's more important is why. What is the reason that got them to that place? What were they working on? Because all of them naturally were working on very important, sensible stories that deserve their own attention in every single case. Unfortunately, obviously, for limitations of time, I'm not able to go through all of them, but I invite you to do that, because it gives context as to what is behind all of this. You don't have to just be a journalist. You can also be family and friends of journalists, as was the case of Hatis and Hanan, who were respectively the fiancé and the wife of Jamal Khashoggi, who I'm sure all of you know. And in their case, for example, we proved through means of forensics that Hatis was targeted and infected with Pegasus just days after the murder of Jamal. So there's a very strong correlation, obviously, between what happened to him and what this particular tool enabled in this tragedy. Now, that is just a subset. Here you see a more complete list of names of people that have been confirmed targets. As you can see, it's a decent amount, and probably you can't even read it from the screen. And this is only scratching the surface. We only know a tiny fragment, just the very tip of the iceberg of what is the extent of this particular abuse. So as I mentioned, what does it mean when we start realizing how all of this becomes systematic? How it's no longer, as we thought in the past, occasional exceptions to the norm. As we've been told over and over, there's these new surveillance technologies that have come to be developed and sold in the market are only used for investigating and fighting organized crime and terrorism. What does it mean when suddenly the rhetoric has completely changed 180 degrees and it becomes apparent that the surveillance is exercised systematically against those that are protecting our rights, our freedoms, and are informing us of what is happening in the world. So from journalists, human rights defenders, but even opposition movements, democracy activists, and even, again, family and friends. It becomes not just a gross human rights violation and violations in all of these countries, but also a threat to a free society. I think it's important, though, just very quickly, I'm not going to bore you with technical details, but to give you a context as to what has been the progression of this technology in very brief terms. Spyware is a piece of software that has to end up on a phone somehow. The way that these are being delivered and the way that the phone, whether it's an iPhone or an Android phone, there's no real substantive difference other than some technical implementations. Needs to be delivered in some way. And in technical terms, we refer to that particular delivery as an exploit. So a way to abuse and leverage a certain vulnerability in the phone itself or in applications that are installed on the phone in order to make it do something that it was not supposed to do, and then eventually lead to the download and infection of the device with that particular spyware. So back in 2016, 17, the most common vehicle was just through SMS messages. So attackers, clients of these companies would just craft very clever SMS messages, luring the targets to click on a link that would lead to the browser being open and then that browser being exploited. So an unknown vulnerability in, say, Safari or Chrome would be abused so that the software would then be installed on it, and then the phone automatically becomes monitored 24/7. Now, just to give you some examples, this is what would it look like if you receive a message like that. This was the message that was delivered to our Amnesty colleague in 2018, so it's a little bit old, but it dealt with topics of protests, organizing of protests against the Saudi government, and it just looks like any regular message. Some other examples, these are from Mahdi, who's a well-known human rights defender from Morocco. And in this case, they were using lures that were very relevant and on point as to what he was working on and what he was interested in. So matters related to human rights or ongoing journalistic events or scandals or political events that had to do with Morocco and generally the Arab world. And again, all of them would carry links, and once clicking on that link, the phone would be exploited. So there's some friction here. They also get a little bit more clever. In the case of Abed Sadek, who's a lawyer from Morocco as well, they use some particular nifty tricks where they would send them messages, always the same message, and they would just spam it constantly and say it was some advertisement about some apartments being sold and with that particular square footage and how much it costed and whatnot. And they were spamming it so incessantly, and at the end of the message, they would say, to stop receiving this SMS, please click on the link. And the link were stopsms.biz, and that actually was an exploit link. So eventually, it's just being infected by exhaustion, in essence, which is a very effective tactic. Things evolve. There's other means of infection that are being researched. There's one particular technique that we observed in some countries that we call network injection. I'm not going to go into excessive detail, but this is actually a picture from a trade show that the company NSO displayed. I think it was at Milpol in France, so a surveillance trade show, showing some equipment that they can sell where they put a van in front of the house of the journalist or the activist or whoever is the client wants to target, and then these will create a fake cellular tower, a fake mobile tower, so that the phone of the person in the house would connect to that tower, having a better signal strength, and through this being able to intercept all of the traffic that the phone was generating, so intercepting all websites visits and so on, and at the first automated opportunity just hijack the behavior of the phone so that they would automatically serve an exploitation site and have the phone infected again. In some cases, we see these being placed at similar equipment sorts of being placed at mobile operators. So mobile operators become somewhat coerced in the delivery of these Trojans. In this case, what it looks like, it's a bit more tricky to identify, again, from the view of a target, from the view of a victim. In this case, most likely, you will see nothing. But in some cases, you might see your browser popping up and redirecting to strange pages which were not the one that you intended to visit because you're being forcefully led to a malicious site. And this was actually taken, this screenshot was taken by a journalist from Morocco called Omar, who noticed this was happening to his phone while he was navigating on the Twitter app and opening a link of a news site, and suddenly he was redirected to strange places and he got suspicious of it. And it just ninja screenshotted this page and sent it to us, and we confirmed that was Pegasus. So there still means to, in those cases back then, to see something happening and be suspicious of. Now, what about today's attacks? What do the attacks today look like? What would you see? Well, there's nothing because you see nothing. The way that attacks are being delivered these days using technologies like Pegasus are invisible and can happen just like this. And at a moment in time, you don't see anything, you don't hear anything, you don't click on anything, there's no interaction, there's no friction, just the pure will of somebody targeting that person will result in that person being targeted and infected. And that's it. Those are what we refer to in technical terms as zero-click exploits. So those are vulnerabilities, exploits for unknown vulnerabilities that function invisibly. So there's no interaction, as I said, with the target. There's no link to click. There's nothing that the person can do to challenge that attack in technical terms. And there's no visual traces because there's nothing left behind. There's no message. There's no missed call. And the target platforms for these kinds of attacks tend to be messaging systems or applications that are tied to an account, as is, for example, WhatsApp and iMessage. And we believe also apps like Apple Music and Apple Photos have been used in the past to deliver attacks like this. So if this is well developed, and the people behind the development of these kinds of exploits are very resourceful and extremely talented, unfortunately, they're extremely reliable, and a target can be reinfected at will. I've seen cases of somebody turning on the phone, and the minute the phone got online, it was infected. I saw somebody that we told their phone was infected for the last few months and decided to buy a new phone, plugged in the SIM card. The moment that the SIM card was activated, it was infected. There's nothing to do about that. So these attacks come at a great human and personal cost. And I can tell you that for people to discover the fact that I've been put at such extreme surveillance, because you can imagine is having not just somebody watching over your shoulders 24/7, but worse, because it's not just seeing everything, it's having access to everything. It's having access to all your accounts. It's having access to all your emails, all of your pictures, even from years before. This can be an extremely traumatic experience, and this is something that is largely unexplored. But learning that as a journalist or as an activist, you have been monitored for years or months or even just weeks is enough. What does it mean? And I see people that we deal with, that we support, going through this process of guilt, feeling that they've done something wrong, and responsibility as to who else might have put in danger as a result back home. The reality is they have no fault in this. The fault is in the technology that failed them. And that technology is the same technology that we are using every day. They use the same iPhones that we're using. They use the same Androids that we're using. And the nature of these attacks is such as that I described with these so-called zero-click attacks gives such a sense of powerlessness that can be extremely aggravating for that mental health of that person, but also discouraging as to what can I do? How can I go back home and continue doing the work that I was doing before when I cannot trust anything that I'm communicating? And this is an extremely disempowering effect to have for somebody to eventually just go sometimes to the extreme of abandoning their work, abandoning their country, or abandoning technology altogether. And that is a reality, unfortunately. So what can we do about this? Well, firstly, there's technology, then there's accountability, then there's policy reform, and all of these things have somewhat of an equal weight. And not single one of these. So we can't do anything technical that will stop this problem altogether. We can't just take one company to account and stop this problem altogether, as much as policy reforms will not be the immediate solution in the short term. So all of this needs to be done at once. So when it comes to technology, and so what can we do technically as engineers, as technologists, as researchers? The key is raising the cost of the successful exploitation and infection of devices. And I say our devices because, as I said, it's everyone's devices. Protecting one means protecting everybody. And these result, the way it's done for a company that produces technology, whether it is Apple, whether it is Google, Microsoft, or anything in between. Because we know now that smartphones are targeted, but we know very little about what else can be targeted. Could IoT devices being used in the same context? Probably already are or will be soon. So there is a mindset that needs to be installed for people that produce consumer technology, knowing that there will be a good portion out of your customer base and user base out there which will be at heightened risk that you might have not considered because your product is innocuous and serves a very simple utilitarian function. So improving the security mitigations for consumer electronic devices is a big part of that. And the reason why this is important is because there is an asymmetry of power that is the result of this dynamic that I'd explained. The same people who are most likely to be targeted, and unfortunately it's a much wider population than we had thought about, that we believed it was some years ago, are equipped with the same technology that everybody else has. They're not big enterprises or big governments with huge resources and money to spend on security products and services and consultants and anything like that to help protect themselves. It's regular people with regular electronics, regular devices, regular services that will use the same iPhone that we use, the same email account that we use, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, they're facing the same threats that those big enterprises, those governments are facing, and they're better equipped to protect against. So there's a natural asymmetry there, where they're not provided with the sufficient means and resources to face the threats that they're being challenged with. So as a result, as I mentioned already, protecting vulnerable communities means protecting all of us. Another part is continue doing this research and exposing these abuses and letting more people know and be more participant into this work. So support existing research group, create new ones, whether it's in academia, whether it's in NGO, whether it's in your private sector, in your security company, whatever it is that there's marginal kind of interest in this subject, there's certainly work that can be done. And the more, the merrier, because we're way too few. Coming to accountability, I was very shocked to see protests and demonstrations happening in many countries as a result of the revelations of the last year, and people taking actions to demand change and demand a halt to this systemic abuse that have been happening in so many countries. Not just people, some companies also and institutions have taken action too. WhatsApp has been suing the company over exploiting their product. In 2019, WhatsApp was one of those zero-click delivery channels where the company had found or acquired a vulnerability for WhatsApp that WhatsApp did not know about, and as a result, people were infected with it. Apple is doing the same. They're suing NSO as a result of the exploitation of their products, and try to basically send a message and say, we don't want people to use our products and abuse our customers in this way. And this is great steps. In November, I believe, also the US Department of Commerce decided to add the company NSO Group to a control list of essentially kind of sanctioned companies, although it's not quite the same as sanctions, that will heavily discourage people to do business with companies like that and others that are mentioned in this list, not just NSO Group. But these are actions that do have an effect. As a result, just again in November of last year, Bloomberg reported that the company is at risk of default because of a sales drop as a result of all these revelations. So there is an effect, and all of these tiny little bricks coming together can effectively change things. There's another thing to put out there, which is oftentimes, and this was not just the case with NSO, but also with companies in the past, like maybe you've heard of Hacking Team in Italy, which was another company that abruptly ended some years ago as a result of a hack by the famous Phineas Fisher. Some of these companies often are bankrolled by public investment funds, taxpayers' money, by pension funds, and also by private investors. It needs to be understood that a surveillance industry such as this, which is systematically enabling human rights abuses, should not be a desirable business investment. And investors need to take action and responsibility for the role that they've played in this as well, in creating an industry that is so uncontrolled. Now, from a policy-making perspective, things have started to shift. So as I said, in 2012, there was a first sort of wave of attention as to what was the role of companies providing and building surveillance technology in, at the time, especially connection to the protest movements in North Africa. And so in 2014, we started seeing an effort to start creating regulations which were eventually put in effect to control the exportation of technologies such as this from within Europe. Because at the time, mostly were actually European companies, Italian and German and British for the most part. Now, years later, things have changed. Now it has become apparent that it's not just that European countries are producers and exporters of technologies like this, they're also abusers, as it came out. Journalists in Spain, politicians in Spain, journalists in Hungary, opposition in Poland, these countries are abusing the same products they're abusing everywhere else. There's no difference. But they're also targets of foreign states. In France, journalists and politicians and ministries have been found infected with Pegasus as a result of the investigations revelations of last year. This is raising questions, and some are calling it a crisis of democracy. As I mentioned as some examples, after the publication of the Pegasus Project, governments started scrambling around and trying to figure out if they were hacked too, and more things started coming to light. Journalists in Belgium that before we did not know about. French intelligence confirming that the journalists we found were actually infected. French ministries have been found to be infected. Government officials in Finland have been found to be infected. And then the ensuing scandal in Spain, which you might have heard about regarding both the hacking of Catalonian opposition as well as Spanish government and ministries using the exact same Pegasus software. However, what does it mean, though? We're only talking about one company. And even if action is taken against this company, will this change things significantly? The reality is very different. Next week, there will be a gathering of all of these companies in Prague for ISS World, which is the most famous trade show of surveillance technologies, and you'll find all of these. And NSO is the lead sponsor, but as you can tell, and these are only probably the most public, the most vocal companies out there, there will be dozens more taking its place whenever one goes. There is a systemic issue here in a multi-billion-dollar industry which has gone unregulated and unchallenged for way too long, creating now a scenario where we will live in where nobody that is doing anything marginally critical or risky has no virtue of knowing whether their communications can be secure. So international, regional, and national policy changes are necessary. And until appropriate regulatory frameworks exist that will start governing in and putting a halt to this chaos, we believe we need to support a global moratorium, which means putting a halt to the sale of surveillance technologies such as this until the time is right when laws will be put in effect and control this systemic abuse. So lastly, to close, the European Parliament has launched an inquiry of committee as a result of the Pegasus investigations, which is an extremely important thing and a pretty rare occurrence in and of itself. So I invite you to push your representatives in the European Parliament to make sure that this inquiry will have an effect and will result in action. And to leave you with one little positive note is that change can happen. And if you remember that first German company I mentioned at the beginning 10 years ago, 2 months ago declared bankruptcy. So as a result of a criminal investigation that spawned after revelations of abuse such as this. So things can happen and change is possible. With that, I thank you. And Please, if I don't think we have time for questions, but you can catch me in and around the conference for the rest of the day if you have additional questions. And thank you again for having me here.